Just a reminder that today is the third Sunday, so it's an extended homily and question-answer discussion at the end. And because of the topic of the homily, I've chosen a little short reading from James's epistle. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts nobody. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Word inspired by God. There's a funny story behind today's homily. Way back in March, when we had the St. Patrick's Day celebration and they were raffling off different kinds of prizes, somebody came up with the notion, I have no idea what it was, that one of the prizes that should be raffled off was a homily. And that whoever won this raffle ticket could decide the topic of a homily. Yeah. And Jane Oy won it. Yeah. And typical Jane Oy fashion, instead of kind of picking out a topic herself, she sent an email around to everybody, trying to poll people what do they want, to be addressed in the homily. And it seems that the major opinion was that they wanted a homily on the problem of evil. And so last week I get an email from Jane saying, this is the choice. You need to talk about the problem of evil. And so that's what I'm going to do today. And it's going to be a fun exercise. I have no idea how long it's going to go on. No idea whatsoever. But I'm basically going to divide it into two sections. In the first section, I'm going to try to do a review of the biblical, religious literature on the notion of evil. And then in the second section, I'm going to give my own synthesis and my own belief systems around the problem of evil. But it's not just two sections, because the first one has 3 main points and the second one has 2 main points. So in the first section, I'm going to give a review of the biblical, religious, and theological literature, and I'm going to make 3 main points in that section. I'm going to talk about a brief history of the notion of evil, and then secondly, a brief history of the notion of guilt, and then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the notions of heaven and hell. And then in the second section of it, I'm going to make 2 main points. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the 8 important factors if you're trying to figure out the idea of evil. And then the second one, I'm going to draw a conclusion of my own. So that's where we're going to go, hopefully. And then we're going to open it up to question and answer discussion. So I hope you brought your lunches with you. Okay. So section 1, main point number 1. I'm going to give a brief history of the literature around the notion of evil. And there's going to be 11 sub-points in this one. I'm going to start way back with the Sumerians. The very first civilization on planet Earth goes back to 3800 BC. And it's the Sumerians, modern-day Iraq. And from nowhere, they suddenly gave birth to mathematics, philosophy, building, agriculture, literature, marriage as a covenant, divorce, adoption, religion, temple building, all of these kinds of things, from nowhere. But in their own literature, they claim that it actually came to them from an extraterrestrial group called the Anunnaki, who visited Earth in the year 445,000 BC and genetically upgraded a bunch of hominids, to be a workforce for themselves. So it's interesting that they were then built. The Sumerians did not believe that the Anunnaki were their creators, but that they genetically manipulated a bunch of, Neanderthals or, previous hominids to upgrade them to Homo sapiens status so they could be useful to the Anunnaki in their own work on planet Earth. So they upgraded them and they gave them all these laws. But the Anunnaki themselves, according to the Sumerians, were constantly at war with each other and quite promiscuous. And finally, they involved human beings in their promiscuity and also in their warmongering. And so at some stages, we hear reports of Anunnaki, these god figures, having intercourse with humans and giving birth to a group called the demigods. So now you've got the early hominids, now you've got the upgraded Homo sapiens, you've got the gods who came from the skies, and now you've got demiurges or demigods someplace in between. And so the first notion of evil and good you find in the Sumerian. And it's the warring nature of these, in whose image we've been upgraded. So we were upgraded into warlike creatures, and all kinds of concupiscence. And so there's the first notion of evil you find as you track the history here. That these God figures, they didn't regard them as their creators, but they did regard them as having genetically upgraded them. And so they owe a lot to them. And from there, they're learning how to make war, how to make love, and how to steal from each other. And so you get this good evil. They also gave them science and orthography and pottery making and agriculture and law and temples and religions. And so it's a very divided. This good and evil comes from the very, very, very beginning. The second group coming along then is kind of what I'm going to just describe as the Greco-Roman world. And in the Greco-Roman world, you get the very same notion that there are gods up there, and there's a pluriformity of them. There are 12 main divinities, presided over by Zeus, and these are our creators. And they interfere constantly in human affairs. And sometimes the bad things that happen to us are the direct result of the gods being angry with us, and sometimes the bad things that happen are just collateral damage as these gods make war with each other. And just like the Anunnaki, these people regularly have intercourse with humans, and they create a group of demiurges or demigods. So you get the very same notion coming through the Greco-Roman world. Creator gods or manipulator gods who interfere, teach us warfare, and teach us concupiscence, in a sense. So you get the very same notion there. Fast forward now to the Hebrew tradition, or Judaism. And I want to divide this piece into 3 subsections. I want to talk about the period of time when Judaism was polytheistic, and then secondly, when it adopted monolatry. Monolatry is not the belief that there is only one God, but the decision to follow just one God, or to worship one God. And then finally, what happened when Judaism became monotheistic. So in the first section, when Judaism was polytheistic, so we're talking about Adam and Eve and the Elohim. And so in the very beginning of Genesis, you get the statement that the God said, "Let us make man in our own image and likeness." And the noun that's used there is Elohim, which is a Hebrew plural. And it represented the fact that they're polytheistic at this stage, and that these gods, whoever they are responsible for human beings. That they created us and they built us in their own image and likeness. But this God is a very, very volatile God, and they're at war with each other. And so there's a character comes in very, very quickly in chapter 3 of Genesis called the serpent. And the serpent obviously is not just some kind of a reptile crawling on his belly. It's a symbol for some kind of internecine warfare going on among the gods. And one group of gods have this agenda for human beings, and the other guy has a different agenda. And this guy, the serpent, has the agenda that he wants human beings to be self-aware. So he advises them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they become aware. And at this stage, the other gods find out, and they throw them out of the garden, and they're punished in perpetuity. But these gods as well also interfere and have intercourse with human women. So there's a very strange statement in Genesis chapter 6, where it says, "The sons of God found the daughters of men very attractive, and they took them to wife as many as they wanted, and they created the great race called the Nephilim." They're given 2 different words in Hebrew. Sometimes they're called the Nephilim, and sometimes they're called the Anakim. And they're a race of giants. So you get the very same notion coming through as you get with the Greeks, the Romans, and the Sumerians. That these are some kind of creator gods. They're warlike creatures. They're at war with each other, and they also have intercourse with human subjects. So that's the first phase within Judaism. At some stage, Judaism adopts monolatry, and it happens with Abraham. About 1850 BC, Abraham is invited to leave Ur of the Chaldees, where he's from, and that would be modern-day Iraq, and come across the Fertile Crescent into the land of Israel. And he makes a covenant with one of these gods, a god called Yahweh. And subsequently, this god will rescue the people from Egypt, where they've been enslaved for 450 years. And Moses will be the main hero then. And then he'll give them a covenant consisting of 613 laws. He'll give them a constitution, and he'll weld these disparate tribes into one nation, and he'll promise them a land. Now, this God, one of the most important laws is, "Thou shalt not kill." But the God doesn't keep it himself, and finally he enjoins upon his own people to break this law. So I came across a scholarly article a few days ago, somebody who trawled the scriptures to find out just how many murders took place in the Hebrew scriptures. And according to the figures he came up with, God himself directly is responsible for 381,186 murders. God himself, directly. including on one occasion when King David had conducted an illegal census of his people. God personally killed 70,000 Israelites to get back at David. So he presided over the death himself, literally, of 381,186 human beings. And then he ordered the death of another 1,862,265 people. So you look through the scriptures, and this is the God that says, thou shalt not kill. So it's a very, very different notion. These two sides to this God. Now, at some stage, Judaism will adopt monotheism under the influence of Zoroastrianism during the Babylonian exile, which happened between 597 BC and 529 BC. They come under the influence of this great religion called Zoroastrianism, which had reduced all the divinities just down to two, Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. Ahriman is the god of darkness, and Ahura Mazda is the god of light. So now Judaism will have a different notion of good and evil. They've now become monotheistic, but they still do not believe in life after death. So now the equation changes a little bit, and here's the kind of the belief system was, there's only one God, this God is just, there's no afterlife, so everything has to be rewarded and punished now. And therefore, you're obviously blessed by God if you were born Jewish and male and healthy and wealthy. Then obviously God is blessing you. So anybody who wasn't Jewish or who wasn't male or who wasn't healthy or wasn't wealthy obviously is being punished by God for something, either for their own sin or the sin of one of their forebears. And so the notion of good and evil now changes a little bit. It has to do with the infraction of law or the breach of the covenant. So there's kind of the history of Judaism and this notion of evil. And the Essenes were a particular group here, who lived a monastic life in the desert where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found from between 1947 and 1952. And they believed in two great heavenly forces at constant war with each other. And they talked about the sons of darkness and the sons of light. Now this is straight out of Zoroastrianism. So it would have a huge influence on Judaism and subsequently on Christianity. Fast forward to the time of Jesus then himself, and you look at what Jesus' teaching around good and evil is. And so he's ahead of Shakespeare by about 1,600 years when he makes the statement, do not judge and you will not be judged. Now, Shakespeare will take this phrase 1,600 years later and say, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. And Jesus is making the same point. Do not judge. Judging is ascribing ontological value to a person or an event. And Jesus said you can't do that. So what he's advocating is evaluation. Evaluation is very different from judging. Judging is the ascribing of ontological value to a person or an event. It's a good thing, a bad thing, a lucky thing, a non-lucky thing. Yeah, that doesn't work, Christ says. Evaluation is determining the appropriate response to a person or an event. You don't have to categorize it or pigeonhole it, but you do have to make a response, so determining the response. Now, in Jesus' thinking, all evil is of demonic existence. Influence. And so, for instance, his response to any illness, whether it's a physical illness like leprosy, a mental illness, or a spiritual illness, is to cast out the demons. So the thinking at this stage is evil is the work of some kind of demonic entity, some kind of extra-dimensional divinities. And in actual fact, in the beginning of the account of Jesus' own life story, when you come onto Christianity, you find that there's the notion again of some kind of an intercourse between an extra-dimensional entity, whom we call the Holy Spirit, and a human woman. And so the notion again that there's activity going on between the gods of some nature and human beings, you find it in Christianity, in the very beginning of the birth of the Christian mythology, the very same thing. You get into Christianity then, and beginning with Paul. Paul has a belief system that there are three main sources of evil. And the first one is law. He makes a very powerful statement in his epistle to the Romans, which is his first epistle. He says, before there was law, there was no sin. It is sin that creates law. You start making rules and regulations, then people transgress them, and that's how sin or evil enter into the world. And certainly looking at our own times, this is so true. It's almost impossible not to be a lawbreaker in America today. We've multiplied laws so much that we're forced to be criminals. It's impossible not to be a criminal today. So Paul is saying that the first cause of evil and sin is lawmaking. You don't make laws, there's no sin. And so that's the first response. The second response, he says, the second reason for evil is that there's a war going on between the spirit and the flesh. That the flesh itself is inclined, to all kinds of depravity, and the soul is trying to extricate it. So he has this great statement where he says, The good that I would, I do not. It is the evil I do not want to do, I find myself doing. So there's this tug-of-war going on inside the human being between the soul and the corporeality. And there'll be two responses to that. The ascetics then will punish the body in order to liberate the soul, and some forms of Gnosticism will fall into this trap. And then the hedonists will just totally, enjoy the body and ignore the soul completely. So, but the third reason Paul comes up with, so the first one is law, the second one is the war between the flesh and the soul, and the third one is the influence of extraterrestrial entities. Paul says very, very powerfully in his letter to the Galatians, our struggle is not against human beings, it's against cosmic forces of darkness. So again, Paul is saying there's some kind of an influence from outside, some extra-dimensional entities, whether you call them demons or extraterrestrials, interfering constantly in human affairs, and they're another cause of the evil. Fast forward about 400 years and brings us up to the time of Augustine. And Augustine is convinced that original sin is the cause of evil. And there's a difference. We think typically that original sin was the sin of Adam, but that's not original sin. That's not what Augustine means by original sin. That's the first sin, but that's not the original sin. Original sin is very, very different. Augustine lived about 400 AD at a time when the Roman Empire was crumbling and it was being invaded by the Vandals and the Goths coming down from Germany. And the whole thing was falling asunder. And Augustine believed that we are most godlike when we're reasonable and rational and thinking properly. And so the Roman Empire, as it had been constructed, was the essence of rationality and reason, and it worked perfectly like a well-oiled bureaucracy. And now it's falling asunder at the seams. And Paul says that's the activity of some kind of demonic forces. And moreover, he says, when human beings are acting rationally and reasonably, they're most in God's image. And when they're out of control and irrational, they're most ungodly. Now take the moment, the time of intercourse. When you have an orgasm, you're totally irrational. And it's at that stage, Augustine says, that the baby is conceived. And so the child is conceived at the moment when the two parents are most out of sync with God. And that's what he meant by original sin. So every single child is conceived when the parents are totally out of sync with God because they're totally irrational. And that affects everything else. And so Augustine is coming from a place where he was a total promiscuous young man himself. In fact, had a child out of marriage before he discovered and converted to Christianity. And he would have a huge influence on Christianity subsequently. Right throughout Christian history, the really great sin had to do with sexuality. If you were born Catholic, there were only two basic sins, breaking the 6th commandment and breaking the 9th commandment, both having to do with sexuality. And so it dogs us right down to the present moment. Fundamentalist Christianity, there's one focus. You get fundamentalist preachers, they're not worried about ecology, they're not worried about nuclear warfare, they're worried about abortion, artificial contraception, homosexuality, masturbation, premarital sex, extramarital. That's their total focus. So right down still, the notion of evil is this notion that has to do with sexuality. So this being the Christian notion. And again, it's this preoccupation with breaking laws. In very modern times then, the Catholic Church added a whole bunch of other injunctions to it. In case it wasn't tough enough to keep the 10 Commandments and the 613 precepts of the Torah, they added a whole bunch of their own. Like if you miss Mass on Sunday, you're going to go to hell. Or you eat a sausage on a Friday, you're going to go to hell. So they piled on a whole bunch of more laws, creating more and more possibility for crime and for evil. I'm going to go on then for a few moments to look at Hinduism. Hinduism is an ancient system. For Hindus, the primary sin is Maya. It is illusion. It is buying into physicality as being the ultimate form of reality. That's the basis of all sin and all evil. And what happens is that we get reincarnation and karma to allow us the opportunity to wake up. And so however many lifetimes it takes to wake up and realize that the physical world, I'm not saying it's not real, it is real, but it is not the primary form of reality. And therefore by coming back again and again and again and working off all our illusions, we finally come into total cohesion with Source, and then we meld back into Source. And then once again, you find in Hinduism a huge emphasis on the influence of extraterrestrial entities on human affairs. In Hinduism, the good guys are called the Devas, and the bad guys are called the Asuras. And there's constant internecine warfare going on in the heavens, and they actually describe they describe aircraft that they're called vimanas, and they describe in great detail the propulsion systems and the capabilities of these aircraft and what happens when these are at war with each other. So there's some kind of an extraneous influence, interfering with human affairs. So that was the Hindu model. Buddhism would come up with the notion that evil, in a sense, is the discrepancy between the misunderstanding between pain and suffering. So the Buddha would say very famously one time, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Pain is the price of incarnation, being born into physical bodies that are subject to illness and death. So one of the things that Augustine had said, in fact, was that the result of original sin were threefold. It was that our will was weakened, our intellect was darkened, and our bodies were subjected to illness and death. And so he's picking up on the Buddhist notion here. And so the Buddha will say that pain is the price of incarnation. Suffering is always the result of inadequate interpretations of the experiences of the pain. And as a psychologist, I can tell you that my experience is that 95% of human discomfort has to do with suffering, not with pain. It's not the experiences per se that create the distress, it's the interpretations people foist on the experiences they're having that creates the suffering. So the Buddha would be very keen, again, that in some sense evil actually is a result of a misunderstanding of our purpose and our experiences here on planet Earth. And particularly, living out of compassion, not exercising compassion, but being away from compassion, that creates all kinds of evil for us. I've gone to Confucianism for a few minutes. Confucius was a contemporary of the Buddha, lived about 500 BC. Confucius believed that all human beings, in some senses, live in a state of illusion, that the notion of the individual self is an illusion created by the sum of our social roles. So he believed that there are 5 constant relationships that define a human lifetime. There's the relationship between husband and wife, between parents and children, between elder brother and younger siblings, between teacher and student, and between the emperor and the governed. And the self is actually an illusion created by the overlapping of these roles. There isn't actually an individual self, he taught. It's just an illusion created by the sum of these social roles. And if you break these roles, if you step out of these roles, you're not obedient to your parents or to the emperor or whatever, that is what creates evil. And then you have Zoroastrianism, which I've mentioned before. It's a system that goes back about 600 BC and had a huge influence on Judaism and Christianity. And it basically was the first effort to reduce the polytheistic, pantheon of divinities down to 2. Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and Ahriman, who was the god of darkness. And these are constantly warring with each other. And you get that influence coming through very strongly in the Essenes and in John's Gospel particularly. John talks a lot about the forces of light and the forces of darkness. So I had to leap forward then, say, to, let's say, Shakespeare. Shakespeare made this very famous statement, I think it was in Hamlet, where he says, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, there's 2 ways to unpack that statement. Is Shakespeare saying good and bad do not exist, so it's an illusion to think that they do? Or is he saying that good and bad do not exist until thought creates them? So by thinking, you actually bring into being the very thing you're thinking about. So you can unpack it in either of these 2 ways. But in either case, what he's saying is it either doesn't exist and it's not useful to try to categorize experiences into these 2 kinds of groups, or else thinking about that actually creates the categories and creates the reality of the categories. And then the final thing I'll say in this section is come right up to the national security state. And now it is impossible to discover what's good and what's evil, because all the things that were good are now evil, and all the things that were evil are now good. So in the name of national security, not only is it permissible, but you'll get medals. If you go to a foreign country and kill people in a foreign country, you get medals for it. If you come back here and do the same thing here, you'll get the electric chair. It's permissible and even rewarded with medals if you go overseas and you steal property from people overseas. If you come back here and do that, you're going to wind up in prison. It's totally permissible and is rewarded with medals if you go overseas and you tell all kinds of lies. You're a CIA agent and you tell all kinds of lies that topple democratically elected regimes. You come back here and you try that, you're going to get in prison. And so the national security state is the ultimate in a sense of upscuttling values. Saying what used to be regarded as good isn't good, and what used to be regarded as bad is not bad. So that's the first sub-point under history. The second one I want to look at very briefly, the notion of guilt or causality. So at one stage, I trawled right through the Judeo-Christian scriptures to see if I could identify how the notion of guilt evolved. And here's my synopsis of it. So initially, there was the sin, whatever it was, of Adam and Eve, for which they were thrown out of the garden. But none of them would accept responsibility. So when God came and said, why were you hiding from me? Now, this obviously is not the God who created everything. This obviously is some kind of an extra-dimensional being who was able to, walk in the garden with them in the evening. And he sees that they're hiding, and he says, why were you hiding? And they said, because we discovered we were naked. And he said, how did you discover you were naked? And they said, well, the serpent that you put in the garden with us, he tempted us, and he tempted the woman, and she ate the apple, and she persuaded me to do it. I didn't want to do it, but she forced me to do it. And he says to the woman, why did you do that? And she said, it wasn't my fault. It was the snake guy that you made. You made it. It's your responsibility. And so everybody gets punished. The snake has to crawl in his belly for the rest of his life. Women are going to bear children in pain. And the husband has have to earn his bread in the sweat of his brow. And they're kicked out of the garden. And there are 2 angels put to guard it. So 2 kind of military guys with swords to keep them out of the garden. So the first stage of culpability or guilt is that one couple's sin and everybody subsequently is guilty. In perpetuity, their kids forever and ever men are guilty and can't get into the garden anymore. That's the first stage of guilt. The second stage of guilt is, at some stage, God is doing really, really badly in the polls. This guy, Yahweh, is doing really, really badly in the polls. And so he figures out, I got to back off here a little bit. And so he sends out a new decree. I'm not going to punish people in perpetuity. I'm only going to do it for the 3rd or 4th generation. So if somebody commits a sin, I'll punish him, I'll punish his kids, I'll punish his grandkids, I'll punish his great-grandkids, but after that, I'd ease up. So now we're backing off a little bit. In the time of Moses, it comes back even further. Moses' brother was Aaron. He was the first high priest. And there's now a new ritual of forgiveness of sin, whereby once a year, all of the Israelites will come to Aaron and confess their individual iniquities. And then Aaron will take the whole load, and he'll find a goat, a young kid from the flock, impose hands on the goat, and confess the sins of the people onto the goat, and then the goat is sent off into the desert to be killed by a lion or something. And that's the origin of the word scapegoat. So now everybody is guilty, but only one person is punished. So it's a very different notion. The 4th stage comes with Ezekiel and Jeremiah, about 600 years before Christ. And they quote this Hebrew proverb that says, the parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. So it was the parents who ate the sour grapes, but it's the kids' teeth that are set on edge. They say, no longer will this proverb be quoted in the land of Israel. From now on, only the person who eats the sour grapes will have their teeth, feel funny. In other words, only the individual who commits the transgression will be punished. Now that looks like it's the end of the road. You can't get better than that. Christ brings it forward 2 more stages. And the first stage is, he says, very famously, in a very tough passage in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, where he says woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You bind heavy loads, and you put them on people's backs, and you won't lift a single finger to help them yourself. So Christ is indicating that the lawmakers are responsible for the lawbreakers. If you make really ridiculous, difficult laws and you don't help people out, you're actually creating criminals and you're creating lawbreakers, and you, the lawmakers, are responsible for their crimes. So that's stage 5. And stage 6 is Christ's own response to that entire system, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is to respond always with love and always with compassion. And then finally, to actually give his life in the service of love and the service of compassion. And that's the ultimate form of, guilting. It is to respond to life, whatever the circumstances are, with as much love as you can command. That's the second point under section 1. And the third point is this. I want to look at the notion of heaven and hell. It's a very strange notion. So I'm going to say actually heaven and hell and places in between. Because we've created this, the ultimate caste system is a belief in heaven, hell, purgatory, and limbo. So there's the 4 castes. Now, if you had to choose, if you grew up Catholic and you know what these 4 things mean, if you had to choose between limbo and purgatory, which one would you choose? Purgatory. So purgatory, you're going to suffer like crazy, but there's a shelf life, and you're going to get out and go to heaven. Limbo, there's no suffering whatsoever, but you'll never get to heaven. You'll only go to limbo if you're an unbaptized baby who didn't commit a sin. You can't get to heaven because you got original sin, because of the fashion in which your parents conceived you, but you didn't do anything personally wrong, But you still have original sin, you can't go to heaven, but you can be in limbo. So God is going to send down people to change your nappy on a regular basis, and to give you food, but you're never going to see God. So if it's a choice between limbo and purgatory, George is going to choose purgatory, because at least you're going to get out at the end and you're going to get to heaven. But we created these 4 categories, this kind of caste system. From hell, which is the worst, to limbo, which is the next, to purgatory, which is the third, and then heaven. So let me look at those 2 notions of heaven and hell for a few minutes. Hell is basically an extrapolated, an amplified notion of human fear and human gloating. So hell only makes sense if we're operating out of fear of being punished or gloating about the enemy being punished. There's a phrase, a word in German, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Stefan, Schadenfreude, how do you pronounce it? Is it, say it again? Schadenfreude? Schadenfreude. Okay. Where you take great gaudium, take great pleasure in the misfortune of the enemy. Now, hell is the ultimate form of that, where you're taking great gaudium, in the fate of others. In fact, there's a notion in medieval Christianity that the great joy of heaven wasn't that you were sitting, playing harps around God, but that there were these huge, big, high-definition television sets where you actually got to see what was happening down below and watch the suffering of the damned. That was the real joy of heaven, that you got to participate and watch the agonies of the damned down below. I kid you not. The television piece I made up, obviously. The rest is true. And so this is the ultimate, that hell is based on fear of being punished and gloating that the enemy is going to be punished. How any loving person, how any person who's interested in enlightenment could believe in the notion of hell doesn't make any sense to me. So hell is not an ontological reality, it is merely a sociological and a psychological reality. Hell exists in the mind, and hell exists in our sociological systems, where we create hell on earth for other peoples. We create hell on earth in our own minds through our psychological thinking. But ontologically, it does not exist. There is no such thing as eternal separation from source. It cannot be. And then we create the notion of heaven, and the notion of heaven is somehow that if you're a good boy or a good girl, you get rewarded. Now again, there are 2 stages of this process. Before people believed in life after death, heaven consisted of a series of covenants, that people made with one or more gods. And so, for instance, Abraham made a covenant. There was no life after death at the time of Abraham. So the covenant here was heaven on earth consisted of having kids. Because he was barren, or his wife was barren, they had no kids. So if only we could conceive and give birth to a child, which they did, Isaac, that's heaven on earth. And God promised him, in fact, he said, I guarantee you, your progeny will be more numerous than the grains of sand on the shores of the sea or the stars in the heaven. That's heaven, as far as Abraham is concerned. There's no afterlife. But if you had lots and lots and lots of kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, wow, couldn't get much better than that. At the time of Moses, they still didn't believe in a life after death. And now the idea of heaven was a promised land, a piece of real estate that would belong to them. So that now is the idea of heaven. We get our own territory to rule our own territory. 200 years later, in the time of David, the notion of heaven, there's still not an idea of life after death. The notion of heaven is that David's dynasty would rule Israel forever. So it's a dynasty. Heaven is now a dynasty. Only very, very later, when we believe in the notion of a life after death, will heaven take on a new kind of meaning. As now, there's going to be some kind of an extra dimensional space in which we get to hang out with God forever and play our harps and watch the bad guys down below suffering. So that's the whole first section. How long am I talking so far? Okay. So that's the review of the situation. In the second part now, I want to just give you my own kind of synthesis or my own understanding of it. And here I'm going to identify 8 factors. If you want to understand a notion of evil, you have to factor in 8 parts of the equation, 8 factors of the equation. And the first one is an adequate understanding of source, or God. So there is only God. But God decides to share her joy of being with beings that are not her, which in some sense is a paradox because there is nothing which is not God. But God plays this game where she self-fractures in order to create beings who can have experiences. And so the first part of the equation is there is only God. You can't understand the problem of evil or good unless you realize that there is only God. It's the first factor. The second factor is now God self-fractures into what are called souls. So souls are individual shafts of the golden light from the sun, which is source. And these beings, that's the second factor you have to be aware of. The third factor is these beings volunteer for incarnation so as to have the experiences which allow God to be able to tell stories to herself around the fireside. And so incarnation involves, it's at this stage that the effluent hits the ceiling appliance. And so now incarnation is going to involve 4 very significant limitations. And the first limitation is that we're going to have to try to understand our experiences with this tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears. Now, problems are going to start here. Because this little laptop is so small that we cannot possibly grok the entirety of the plan. And so that's the first difficulty we experience. The second difficulty is we're locked into chronology because of these small minds of ourselves. So we're looking at a little slice of timelessness which totally misrepresents what the journey is about. So if you don't believe in reincarnation, or you don't believe that you're a soul who is eternal, and your only experience is the 50 or the 60 or the 70 years on planet Earth right now, and things have been really, really tough for the last 2 years, then you already created evil, and you've created hell in your own mind. So time is the second constraint that creates the notion of the problem of evil. The third one is that we're enfleshed, we're born into physical bodies, and these physical bodies are subjected to the laws of gravity and illness and aging, and to the war that goes on between the flesh's needs and the soul's purpose. That's the third piece. And the fourth piece within this incarnational model is the amnesia which is created at the moment of birth for who you really are and what your purpose is. So a lot of what we take to be evil is the inability to remember who we are and why we came. So the third great force is incarnation. The fourth great force then is the whole notion of evolution. This is an evolutionary trajectory that began in God's womb and ends in God's heart, and is taking at the moment 13.7 billion years of human time to continue to work itself out, and it will take a lot longer than that. And in that process, there's a whole sweep of movement. So right on planet Earth, we're just 4.6 billion years of age. So initially, for the first 0.8 billion years, there was just the rock. And so it operated according to just chemical processes. If rain fell, something happened to the rock. If the wind blew, something happened to the rock. If the sun shined, something happened to the rock. So the only response to environmental kind of influence was some kind of chemical reaction. At some stage, flora come into being, and now there's some kind of an instinctive life form. So for instance, if you reach out on the water and you touch a sea anemone, it'll contract. So there's an instinctual ability to react in movement to the environment. At some stage, animals develop, mammals come with the ability to feel emotions. At some stage, Homo sapiens arrived, and he's now able to think. And so there's this trajectory that we're watching on planet Earth, but we're not anywhere near the end of it. There are at least 2 more stages beyond Homo sapiens. And one is Homo spiritualis, and the other is Homo, just call it unitas, where we realize that there is only God. So we're at a very, very early stage of the process. If you don't get that, then things look evil, when in fact they're not. They're just part of the trajectory. Every little single child is going to ontologically recapitulate the phylogenetic history of the race itself. So every little baby is going to be born as a single cell. It's going to be a fishy creature swimming in the amniotic fluid. It's going to come out onto terra firma, and it's going to be a reptile. It's going to crawl around. At some stage, it's going to become Homo erectus. It's going to stand up. At some stage, it's going to be Homo sapiens. It's going to start thinking. At some stage, it's going to become Homo sapiens sapiens. It'll start self-reflecting. So we're all part of this journey, but the journey needs to continue. And we try to shut it down. So there are 3 basic stages. There's the ego-centered one, there's the ethnocentric one, and there's the eco-central one. As we move from just self-concern to concern about the tribe to concern about the whole planet. But the national security state always shuts us down at ethnocentricity. And what was good before is evil afterwards, and what was evil before is good afterwards. So we have to factor in the evolutionary trajectory. You cannot understand good or evil if you can't see it in the context of the whole evolutionary sweep. The next piece, the next factor is the arrival of the ego. And the ego creates all kinds of issues. Ramakrishna said very powerfully one time, all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the soul. The tiny gap between the ego and the soul is the reservoir or the archives of all human suffering. The Buddha said the very same thing. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And there are 2 forms of ego. Every individual has an ego, but every community also has an ego. And of all the communities, the most definitely the most devious ego of all is the ego of the oligarchy. And you find oligarchies in religious organizations, you find oligarchies in political systems, you find oligarchies in military organizations. And when a small group of people take responsibility and control over the community, then the ego, that oligarchical ego, creates all kinds of problems for everybody else. So a lot of the evil that we experience is the result of the ego of the oligarchy imposing its system on the wider community. That's what happens here. And one of the first things they will always do is the next factor, and that is the multiplication of laws. So the more laws you create, the more possibility there are for distress and evil, and crime and punishment. So law becomes the next great factor in the equation. The next one, and I've mentioned now many, many times in the historical review, is the presence of extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional or gods. You can give it any term you want. Now, there's a technical difference between extraterrestrials and extra-dimensionals. Extraterrestrials are beings who have physicality, but who don't live on planet Earth. Extra-dimensionals are beings who may not have physicality at all, so they either exist in a non-physical state in different dimensions, or they have the ability to occasionally, volitionally manifest in physical form, but they don't normally hang out in that. And we've called these creatures of both kinds, we've called them gods. The Sumerians called them the gods, the Romans did, the Greeks did, the Hebrews did, the Hindus did. We've called these creatures whom we don't understand gods, because they're so technologically so far ahead of ourselves. Now, these beings come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Just like if you take the Europeans who went to Africa in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, there were three basic types of Europeans that went to Africa. The first I call the good guys. They went there to improve the medical and the agricultural and the educational systems there. Then there were the neutral guys, the anthropologists, who weren't particularly interested in doing anything, but just observing and figuring out how the cultures worked or how the languages worked. And then there's the bad guys, the military who went there to conquer, and the colonialists who went there to grab land. And we got the same thing with the extraterrestrial life. There's all kinds of beings who have intervened in planet Earth throughout history and continue to do so. There's people with a very beautiful agenda who are interested in human evolution. There are people who are just ETs who are just observing planet Earth because it's an interesting state of our development. And there are people who have a particular agenda. So they come in many, many, many guises. Now, I think that on a spectrum of timeline, there are some extraterrestrial civilizations who are just a few hundred years ahead of us. And there are others who are literally billions of years ahead of us, because there are parts of this universe that are 3 times older than planet Earth. So if you encounter an extraterrestrial who is just a few hundred years ahead of you, it's like a warrior in the middle of the Amazon meeting a helicopter full of tourists for the first time. It's absolutely shocking, but you recognize that they're humanoids. So it's a shocking system because of the technology, but you recognize there's humanoids here. If you were to encounter an extraterrestrial who's billions of years ahead of you, it would be the equivalent of a dandelion meeting a human being. There is no way that the dandelion has any kind of faculty even to recognize the existence of the one who plucks it and blows it away into nothingness. And so we have this entire panoply of influences. And they're a very important influence on the issue of evil, particularly the less advanced ones, the ones who are just marginally ahead of us. Because at some stage, every civilization is faced with the possibility of self-annihilation as a species, when we start developing nuclear arsenals. And so the good news is the ones who are way, way, way ahead are much more numerous than the ones who are just only recent ahead of us. And they're the ones who, we may call them angels, we may call them protectors. They do not intervene unless they're invited. They operate by the prime directive. The other guys come in and they get involved whether they're wanted or not. And every single religious system has acknowledged that these are real and these influence the human condition. And the number 8, factor number 8 is what I call the wild card. We live in a universe which is physical and a planet which is physical. And it is a two-sided, mother. Because the same mother that gives us the sunset to make us, mystically ecstatic, also has tornadoes and earthquakes that kill large groups of people. So that's the wild card in the problem of evil. So you put these 8 different factors together, and then you begin to understand, perhaps, how to wrestle with the notion of evil. And my final concluding remarks. I believe that there is only God, and there's a single safari, which is a trajectory, an evolutionary trajectory that begins in God's womb and ends in God's heart. And we find ourselves somewhere in the middle of that trajectory. But we need to appreciate the totality of that trajectory. And then when we do that, every single experience we have, every single experience, good, bad, or indifferent, is meaningful now, is necessary, and is even beautiful when we understand that. That literally, it's all literally an opportunity to afford individual souls the chance to move through all the stages of growing until we're finally totally free to love unconditionally. So finally, you've got a choice between two fields. You can choose the field of the final judgment, this horrific notion, the ultimate insult to God, that at the end of time, God is going to assemble all 111 billion people who've ever lived on planet Earth, and there's going to be a judgment in full view where every single one of us is going to get embarrassed, and then some people are going to get the thumbs up, and others are going to get the thumbs down. That's one field. Or you can choose a field where all beings realize that ultimately this was a journey in love. And then with Rumi you can say, out beyond right doing and beyond wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. Bunny. So can we grab a microphone so I can hear the question? Alfred, can you get Bunny a microphone? Yelling won't work. People behind you won't hear you. Okay. Unless you're an omnidirectional yeller.
Okay, my father would say so.
Okay.
Just a small repetition.
Okay.
You talked about the ones who are just a little bit above
Okay.
us.
Right.
I mean, beyond us,
Right.
and evolved,
Yes.
and the ones that are way beyond
Right.
us. You said, and you called the ones that are just a little bit. There's not so many of
Right.
them, and we might call them angels and other names. And you said they are the ones that don't get involved unless invited, or it's the other ones.
So, right. So Bunny's question is, on the spectrum of, extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional life, there are ones, I believe, who are literally billions of years ahead of us, and there are ones who are just recently ahead of us. The ones that do not get involved, who follow the prime directive, are the advanced ones. They will only intervene on invitation. And so you pray to your angel guardian or you ask for protection, they're more than happy to get involved. In fact, the air is thick with these beings who are watching, compassionately the human journey and willing us toward love, and more than willing to get involved if there's an invitation. The people who are the extraterrestrials, who may be a few hundred years ahead of us, are not advanced enough yet. And they're the ones who don't, in my opinion, don't obey the prime directive and come down here. They're responsible for abduction cases, and there's a lot of that happening if you read the literature. And they also feed on human discomfort. It always amazes me where human beings can actually get off energetically on watching other human beings suffer or watching animals suffer. So two guys into a ring and they beat the crap out of each other in a boxing match, and they're like, yeah, go get him, kill him. Or you put two dogs fighting until they kill each other, or two bulls fighting. And I ask myself, how could people get off on the suffering of another creature? Now, I think that there are some of these not very advanced extraterrestrials who literally, their foodstuff is the negative energy released by human tragedy. And so they're aiding and abetting the process of putting people at each other's throats, wars of various kinds, and literally they're feeding off that energy psychic. They're psychic vampires. And so they're intervening like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Pat. Joe and then Lisa.
Thank you.
Can you hold it right up to your mouth, Joe?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
So many questions. One regards to the superior beings, and it's somewhat connected with the idea that how could someone be truly superior and not to be peaceful?
Absolutely. That's
So
brilliant.
but
Great.
connected to that,
Yes.
I think I know kind of what the answer is on that, but go on.
Yeah. And so Joe's question is, how can a civilization which is advanced, be so still stuck in violence and greed? Because they're not advanced enough, And because intellectual ability does not correlate significantly with compassion or with spirituality. So I come across occasionally, children who have Down syndrome. And they're the most loving people you've come across. I come across scientists who have dedicated their lives, to perpetuating the military-industrial complex and designing all kinds of weaponry of mass destruction. Brilliant, brilliant guys, but it doesn't translate into compassion for other human beings. So intellectual ability is no guarantee of spiritual evolution. But at some stage, all those beings who do not make who are not walking in both legs, the spiritual leg and the scientific, at some stage, every one of those civilizations will self-destruct. Because inevitably there will be internecine warfare, and they'll pull out the big guys, and they'll start employing weapons of mass destruction against each other, and then the whole equation is gone. And so they're going to wipe themselves out. And that happens inevitably, and it's happened many, many times in our cosmos. So give them time, they'll self-destruct. Now the question is, we're on planet Earth, is that going to happen here? Or is the movement towards spirituality and enlightenment, has it got enough energy and legs at this stage by shifting our mindsets that we can override that propensity of the military-industrial complex and save us before we destroy ourselves? Lisa and then Seán.
I had a second part to that question.
Okay.
The idea of God being kind of the projection of all that we do not understand.
Right.
You get an idea and you say, where did that come from?
Yes.
Or you make an incredible physical response to something in sports or something. That's beyond me.
Right.
And we ascribe it a lot of times to some other being. We don't almost believe that we have that capability ourselves. So we kind of invent, if you will, a God.
Right, totally. So obviously when we talk about God, we're talking about metaphors. We can only employ metaphors. All the mystics tell us, that those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. So if I've spoken for an hour this morning, it tells you how little I know. But the truth is that all we can do when we speak about God is use metaphors. So the metaphor is the following, that there are two aspects to the divine. There's the transcendent aspect, which is totally mysterious and which is absolutely ineffable. And then there's the experience we have of life, which is the transcendent manifestation of the divine. Now, even in the manifestation, it is God as well. It's God in drag. So everything is God in drag. So Michael Jordan, who's floating through the air and defying gravity, is in touch with his inner divinity. A mystic meditating on the mountain, a great poet, like a Rumi character that's writing stuff, he's in touch with his inner divinity. So when we're in touch with our inner divinity, love and peace flow naturally. When we're dominated by our ego, so there's two kinds of ruling. There's ego rule, which is driving us towards greed, and then there's the rule of the golden rule. Do not do to any other person what you would not want them to do to you. So we're either going to be driven by the golden rule or by the ego rule. Lisa was next. Yeah.
What's driving evolution?
Okay.
Everything that you have said is always based on this
Yes.
evolving kind of process going forward. Where's that come from? What's that based on?
Right. So I think that in some senses that when we talk about, for instance, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, that what we call God the Holy Spirit is actually the motive force of evolution, that it is source's mechanism for creating a journey of self-awareness on the part of creatures that will go through many, many phases. There's the rock phase, where you're just responding chemically to the environment. There's the kind of the plant phase, where you're responding instinctively to it. There's the mammal phase, where you're responding emotionally to it. There's the Homo sapiens stage, where you're responding intellectually to it. There's the spiritual stage, where you're responding, through love. And then there's the unitive stage, where there's nobody left. The journey is complete at that stage. You've started with God's womb, and you've ended in God's heart. And so the mechanism through which that evolutionary thrust works, I would call it the Holy Spirit. Yeah. So Seán was next, and then Lorraine, and then Ria.
I had a question regarding the new earth. There are many different ideas out there. I mean, we have this, naive idea that bingo, the minute 12:31:12 came, we were going to have a new earth out there, and all by magic, and or God's blessing, whatever. Well, that didn't happen, but it was an opportunity to push us forward at a ship. But then now there's some interesting ideas out there about bringing heaven to earth, and we each have our own universe within us, and that we can create this this heaven on earth right here. And in a sense, I can understand that because we, different people in different places and situations and their perspective create their own world, okay? And then there's others who say, there are dimensions, and this person, one example was of a woman who claims that she has moved into a more crystalline form. In fact, she says she's got crystals underneath her skin, and she lives in Kauai, I think, and she went through a very difficult life, a lot of pain and suffering, in her own perspective of suffering, and now she is, but she moves between dimensions, but it's difficult, and she's here to teach us, that sense of coming into that bliss or oneness and seeing our life with greater compassion, and but it's also self-created through the way we live and how we evolve.
Okay, Smiley, respond. That's a lot of stuff, totally. So you're absolutely right. We create our own experiences of life. We don't create our own reality because there are 7 other billion people pulling on the same rock, trying to move in different directions. So we do not create the reality externally, but we create our experience of reality inside. And we can create either from the self as in ego, or we can create from the self as in soul. And so any notion of heaven on earth which is predicated upon scientific discoveries having to do with our physicality is destined to be a short-lived, experiment. Until we get it that we are soul beings, we're bite-sized pieces of God. There's no possibility for enlightenment or for heaven in the real sense of the word. So we may experience temporary kinds of improvements in our lot through the scientific endeavor, but science is never going to get anybody into heaven in the sense of being totally aligned with Source. That's going to come from a totally different way of being in the world. So I applaud what science is doing by way of making our life easier for us, and the idea, for instance, that through nanotechnology and genetics we may be more brilliant, or we might have greater memories, or we may have night vision. All these things are just ways of upgrading the spacesuit. But we're not the spacesuit. We're the spirit in the spacesuit. So any technology based on just mere science or self-motivated thinking, self as an ego, is destined to be a short-term improvement, but it's not going to work long-term. Lorraine, and then Ria.
It's funny, but I've been wondering about the aliens.
Okay.
And it seems that there's a lot of sexual discrimination
Okay.
with the aliens because it's always the sons of God. You never hear
Yes.
about the daughters of God. And in my astral travels, whenever I've encountered them, they've been guys
Yes.
mostly, and the tall ones or the little grays are kind of neutral. But how come we never hear about the female aliens?
Right. So in actual fact, it's a great question. You go back to the old mythical traditions. And by mythological, I don't mean that they're not true. The Sumerians had women. In fact, the chief scientist among the Anunnaki was a woman scientist called Ninmah. And so she was the one who actually upgraded Homo erectus into Homo sapiens. And so in all the mythologies, in fact, there are goddesses. And so the goddess is just another different word for a female extraterrestrial, where the gods are names for male divinities. And so the truth is that, in the actual literature and the experiences, they're represented, both the male and the female. And as you mentioned, neutral ones. But the neutral ones, I believe actually that there are what are called extra-biological entities, that there are some beings who are visiting us that are literally robots with carbon-based, artifacts. So they look like they're living beings, but they're robotic figures who've been dressed up in carbon spacesuits. So they appear to be living, walking entities, but we're getting there with our own robotics right now, that with artificial intelligence, we're creating robots who are more and more intelligent, and at some stage there's going to be some kind of a fusion between us as carbon-based life and robots as silicon-based life, and it'll be difficult to see what the distinction is. But most of the greys, I believe, are, in fact, they're robotic figures, with some kind of carbon-fused, spacesuits. Ria was next. And then Karen. Jane, look what you unleashed.
Hi.
Look what you unleashed. Ria.
Hello. I have quite a lot of difficulty with the whole concept of extraterrestrials, and I can understand, from historical points of views, like with the Greeks, with the Sumerians, that these are inventions of theirs to explain things. So, coming from that perspective, I would actually like you to comment on Scientologists who actually do believe this stuff. They believe that there's the planet Xenu and that there are these thetans inside us, and reach many levels. And when you read about them, you think they're, their whole idea is preposterous. So, so from my perspective, this whole idea of terrestrials is somewhat off the wall. So I'd really like you to comment on how you would perceive the Scientologists. Am I making myself kind of...
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, the truth is you can corrupt any system. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? And did Jesus Christ count on his crusades and inquisitions and conquistadores? Obviously not. And so you can take any teaching or any understanding of cosmology, whether it's extraterrestrials or it's Jesus Christ, and give it to an organization, and they'll manage to screw it up. And so the fact that Scientology has come up with a version of extraterrestrials that you don't agree with, and I don't know enough about to comment on, doesn't necessarily mean that the entire idea of extraterrestrials has to fall because the Scientologists got a wrong version of it. But the evidence is really, really, really plentiful. And so it's a matter of choice whether you decide to look at the mythology and regard it as just made up stories by primitive peoples who didn't understand it better, or actually race memory, that they actually interacted with these beings and they talked about it, they put it in their stories and they put it in their writings, and it's actually real. So, but that's a choice that each individual has to make. Yeah. Karen.
Joseph Campbell had something interesting to say in his, towards the end of his life, in his lifelong work with mythology, in his interpretation of the Garden of Eden. And he said the two angels with the flaming swords were desire and fear. And that's what kept us from the garden. So if I think about the garden as Rumi's field, then it becomes clear to me that change, however change is going to come in the world, is going to come from the inside of each person. It can be somewhat aided by more enlightened ways that organizations or cultures work, but until we start to fix what's inside each of us and then approach our day in that way, there's not going to be a fundamental change.
Brilliant. And so that statement of Joseph Campbell, that the two angels are desire and what was the second one? Fear. Desire and fear. Again, that's straight out of Buddhism, where the Buddha said all suffering is created by attachment and aversion. They're the two great forces. So my belief is that any truth is simultaneously unpackable on many, many different levels. There's an intrapsychic dimension to it, there's an interpersonal dimension to it, there's a sociological dimension, there's an anthropological dimension, there's a spiritual dimension, there's a mystical dimension. And you find this in working with your dreams, and you work with the parables of Jesus. You can unpack the parables of Jesus as commentaries on the social milieu in which he lived, or you can unpack it as the journey of his soul, the struggle between the ego and the spirit, or you can see it as a kind of a mystical. So every one of these can be unpacked meaningfully at many, many different levels. So Joseph Campbell's unpacking of the Garden of Eden is a beautiful one. And for me, it's just one of the many tiers of possible meaning that it's simultaneously holding. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure. It's the 10 after 11. I go on all day. I'm Irish, guys. And so... Okay, so I think Diane was next. I'm going to try and get people who haven't spoken yet.
So I'm amazed that I'm actually been able to follow all this.
Brilliant.
And I thank you for really challenging, I think, my mind and many of our minds to think outside the box in our normal world. One reflection I have is I grew up watching Star Trek.
Okay.
And I can remember many different episodes that really relate to all this.
Brilliant.
And I don't want to take up any more time in saying that. I did go to the Computer History Museum this week, and they had a huge program all about finding this ancient astrological mechanism that they found in the waters off of Greece. And it just proves, like over and over
Yes.
again, how technologically advanced other societies that were way, way before us. And I thought, wow, that's amazing that we'd have this conversation. And I follow this, I can absorb it, and I would comment personally that because I'm involved in an international organization, aka TED, I do see in the 5 years that I've been involved in it a real shift towards spirituality worldwide with the limited people that I'm in contact with.
That's
so
right.
I do see things changing. But I'm curious, what I really am curious about is, so obviously we have to change, we have to come from compassion and love. And like the Center for Compassion at Stanford, which is funded by the Dalai Lama, this is something personally right here that you can be involved with. But what I found myself going back to is you talking about the different levels of the extraterrestrials and the different civilizations, whether they're far, far in advance of us or whether they're 100 or 200 years in advance to us. And then I blink towards one of the Star Trek episodes and seeing the planet, kind of like disintegrate. And then just recently they're talking about, all of our climate change might be happening by what's happening over in China, and it's affecting our weather patterns. And so then the word ISIS comes in to my brain. And I'm wondering, how do you see, first of all, we're so not in control of that. They're so destroying the antiquities and the civilization. And how do you see ISIS in relationship to your big picture and to evil and to the different civilizations and whether they're robots? I'm just...
It's a great question. You made a great comment, Diana. So for me, when I look historically, in a sense, ISIS isn't doing anything that Christianity didn't do before it. When the missionaries went to Kenya, they destroyed all the local gods and artifacts and whatever. And it's again and again and again. You take the great, the great city of the great Library of Alexandria, probably the greatest archives of human wisdom ever. It was destroyed in Christian times, about 367 BC, because it contained a whole bunch of non-Christian texts. And so again and again and again, when people get into an ascendancy and they're taken over by an oligarchy who are interested in power, they'll do really devastating things to the wisdom and the traditions of the peoples that they've settled and conquered. So ISIS aren't doing anything that many, many peoples haven't done before them, which doesn't justify what they're doing. But we need to get in perspective that we're not the good guys here on the high ground, looking at these savages doing these terrible things, and they are terrible things. That's the first remark. The second remark is, it is precisely when things get to these kind of levels of violence and tragedy that enough people begin to wake up and begin to ask what are the real solutions. And the real solutions are not to go across with drones and kill everybody there. You're just perpetuating a vengeance, a vendetta, which is now it's now 5,000 years old. Beginning with the invention of agriculture, 3000 BC, right down to our times. So the first time ever we had standing armies was with the invention of agriculture. We couldn't afford to have standing armies before that because people were too busy just with their little digging sticks making food. As soon as agriculture was invented, 3000 BC, we had standing armies, we had warfare, we had empires, and we had aggression. And we've tried that for 5,000 years. It hasn't worked. And the great avatars like the Buddha came and Jesus came and said, it doesn't work. What works is love. The only thing that works is love. So if you get enough kind of outbreaks of ISIS throughout the world, then there'll be a corresponding wake-up call to the rest of us, just kind of the neutral people in the middle, who are not doing any bad things and not doing a whole lot of good things, to wake us up sufficiently to realize that there has to be a response, a concerted, organized response, and it has to be based on love. And love does not necessarily mean that you can indulge this kind of violence. You can contain that in many, many different ways, and not just by going in there with B-52 bombers and wiping them out of it. My goodness.
The saddest thing I was going to say is like the whole people from Myanmar that want to flee, and they're all, these countries are turning away all these people to the point where they're like going out and giving them water and food and then saying, sorry, you can't get out of us.
I totally get it. And this has happened again and again and again and again and again. At some stage, we will repeat what's happened, and I think this has been a cycle on planet Earth. I really believe that this civilization has wiped itself out on at least 3 other occasions on the planet. They talk about Atlantis, Lemuria, that this has happened at least 3 other times. And now we have an opportunity to do it again. And we're making the same kinds of mistakes. The question is, will we wake up in time to undo it this time? And this is where you and I and everybody else and the TED people, come into the equation. Christine. And then Ingrid, finish with Ingrid. Oh, okay, sure. So we'll finish with Jane. Okay. Thanks, Michael.
So in response to that, I think that we could ask those interdimensional beings, those angels, who are very real. And, I didn't grow up in a culture where I believed in angels. I grew up in fundamentalist Christianity, where there was a devil, and the devil was in the guise of a, being with a pitchfork and the pointed tail,
Horns.
and the horns and all of that. And it's taken me years and years and years and years to divest myself of that image, and also it also took me years and years and years to believe in those interdimensional beings, in those angels, and I've actually had the experience of literally having that support and help in my life, and I didn't grow up with that that feeling. So we can extend that out to the planet and ask for that interdimensional help and that angelic help on behalf of other people, and to pull our planet into that Christ consciousness space of love, and away from fear and destruction and those dark forces that are real, that will pull us unless we ask for help. And it's really incumbent upon all of us to take that on and to pull us all forward. No one person can do it, but it's really a wave of love and a wave of asking for help, and it's real.
Brilliant, Chris. Brilliant. I'm going to give Ingrid a chance, and then we're going to finish with Jane, who's responsible for this entire thing. Okay. No, we'll start with Ingrid, and then we'll finish with Jane.
Well, I think one of the greatest perversions of our collective consciousness is the concept of original sin.
Yes.
That humans are born depraved, damned, and wicked, and they need to be saved. And that has brought us into a master and slave mentality. And we give our power away to authorities who are trying to limit us and control us and dominate us. And as a part-time pagan, when I do my little rituals, I toast to original innocence and our original blessings of being alive in this particular, human vehicle that we have for a small part of time. But we really have to own, I love that Marianne Williamson quote, that we are afraid of our greatness, not our darkness, that we have to embrace the light, our power, our brilliance, our inspiration, our creativity, our uniqueness. And this is how we're going to save ourselves, each other, and the planet. And all we have to do is one little ratio. It's 50-0-1% altruistic and optimistic. David Wilcox says if you can do that, you're going to shift the collective consciousness, you're going to have more fun, you're going to be more connected, and that's one of the sacred ratios. 50-0-1%. The rest can be ordinary and so-so and whatever, even hedonistic.
Hallelujah, sister. Janie, we're going to let you wind it up.
Well, I have a lot of comments to a lot of the things you said, but I think what I would boil it down to, as I've thought about what you said, is that for me as a child, one of the things you touched on today was a struggle for me as a child. Why would a God who talked about love kill people, punish people, whatever? And I think that for me personally, the first time you mentioned Anunnaki, I was like, oh, I'm out of here. But the bottom line is, it makes a lot of sense to have levels of gods. And in the Tibetan tradition, there's Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya. And I've never understood really, until today I sort of plugged in Nirmanakaya. Those are the gods that are kind of a little ahead of us, but not very. Sambhogakaya are the light beings, the people we pray to and they come. but it's not the ultimate, which is Dharmakaya. To me, Dharmakaya, or the God as the ultimate God, can be the Divine Mother, can be the formless primordial wisdom. It can be the creative force that from which all things come. Those are all names that I would put to that. And so to think about it in that way, I think that one of your beginning statements, which we don't have the laptop, we don't have the power to make sense of this ultimately. And that that's kind of why we have sort of faith, but I'm not a big faith person. I gotta kind of have an experience of it, I gotta kind of know it in some way. And so in a way, the final, to me personally, the final spin on your talk this morning is to find ways within myself to come to grips and to come to acceptance of the formless, that for which I cannot name, that for which I cannot understand, and allow that is bigger than me and that's okay. But in the end, to appeal to that power for what I call the wisdom path. And the wisdom path for me is, how can I, in any situation, come from a place of compassion and love? And I'll go back to the Tibetan for a minute, because their term bodhicitta, which basically boils down to love and compassion for even those you can't stand.
Brilliant, Jenny. Awesome. Guys, it's 20 past 11. I thank you. Thanks, Jane, for coming up, for Johanna with the idea, for Jane for winning it, for Lisa with the kind of the input onto that this was the real topic we wanted to go for, and for the community coming up with it, and for a great discussion today. And I wish we didn't have to go on with Mass, or we'd be here for a while.